I would argue our funniest, most outsized, outrageous novels ever written by a Canadian are Mordecai Richler.
Introduction where he's talking to the rabbis and he gives his character.
Right away, yeah. I'd never written a biography before, and I never really thought of writing one, but Mordecai Richler was a very special author to me personally. He was the Canadian author whose books I loved the most. I waited for when they were, and I tracked his career. He was living in Montreal at the same time as I was, or more exactly, I was living in his Montreal for a period. In fact, I moved to Montreal. When I moved there, I moved into his neighborhood. So, as many Anglophones do when they move up there, they move into Mordecai Richler's Montreal. At this stage in the 90s, he was embarked, or in the middle really, of his great engagement, his raw and angry engagement with Quebec nationalism. So he was this huge figure around town. I came of age in a way reading Mordecai Richler. He was, along with Margaret Atwood, Timothy Finlay, Robertson Davies, Alice Munro, he was a central figure. But he was different. He was a maverick. He was isolated from those others because he was a Montrealer. He was Jewish. He was international-minded and in his perspective. And he didn't seem to be part of Can Con, or Can Lit, if you will, the way those other authors were, who were more associated with Southern Ontario. And I liked that about him. So when I moved to Montreal, as I mentioned, I moved into Richler's neighborhood, and I sort of didn't study him, but I admired him greatly as, from the point of view simply as a model for how to conduct yourself as a professional author, being so busy, so engaged. I mean, he was probably the most socially engaged Canadian author of his time. He and maybe Margaret Atwood, who remains a deeply engaged author. And by that I mean someone who takes it as part of their job, not simply writing the books, but also being a commentator, a critic, a supporter, and Richler and Atwood share that in common. So Richler, because again, I was in Montreal, he was in Montreal, it was the year of Quebec nationalism, it was the lead up to the second referendum, I found his abrasive, honest, scathing commentaries on Quebec's language laws really compelling. Agree with them or not, he was a big-time guy. So I, in a sense, decided that there needed to be a big, rich biography for this big, rich life. He was a loving father of 5 children who are now all themselves quite accomplished adults in the media world and book world. But he was not terribly interested in the psychology of children. He once interrupted his son Daniel, who was around 12, who was giving him one of those typically long-winded summaries of a movie he'd just seen. And Richler interrupted him and said, you know, I can hardly wait till you're grown up so we can have a proper conversation. So he was not a man who necessarily brought to his children's books that kind of interest in child psychology that many kids authors do have. People do talk, I think correctly, about the impact of Harry Potter on young people in terms of creating readers. Richler was very happy, of course, to have the Jacob Tutu books widely read and enjoyed in the theater, in the theatrical versions, and enjoyed on the screen. I don't think, however, those books were central to his, if you will, project as a writer. He really was a very serious adult novelist at heart and social critic as a nonfiction writer. It's important to continue reading his work because the past, in a digital world, the past is in danger. I believe it is in danger of kind of falling away. And in the same way people used to talk about before Christ BC and after Christ AD in the Latin. I feel like we're almost talking pre-digital and post-digital worlds. Mordecai Richler died 9 years ago. At the time of his death, his most recent book sold upwards of 300,000 copies in Canada and was a national bestseller for a year and won the Giller Prize. And he was a weekly columnist in the National Post, and he was on television, and people were quoting him and arguing with him and disliking him. And he was a major player in the Canadian cultural scene. And then, as so often when an author dies, it almost seems like they fall off some sort of cliff. And the job then is to rediscover them, to bring them back up. And it has to be the work, or has to be an account of their life that is sufficiently engaging that you want to revisit that Canada. Mordecai Richler's life encompassed the emergence of Canadian culture almost. So there's an account of that in my book. So it's not just his life, it's also the life to some extent of Canada during the last half of the 20th century. Well, I know. In fact, I got an email. Oh yeah. A biography is a huge project. I felt at times like an entire army invading some unspecified land. And I wasn't just the general, I was also the infantry, the officer class, I was the Air Force, I was the Marines, I was everything. It was a huge task, and a day of writing, say just simply sitting there trying to put together paragraphs, pages, was surrounded by hundreds of other things. And it was nonfiction. I was assembling material, I was lining up events, I was trying to craft. It was a craft job. I hope the prose is good, I hope it's evocative, I hope it's rich, but it's still a job of craft. A novel is something very different, and novels are free. They're free fall. You have nothing in front of you, and you create and invent everything, and you make this entire world, this entire time and space continuum out of words. It is, for someone like myself, the ultimate challenge and the ultimate joy of writing. I spent 5 years working on Mordecai Richler, and then more recently a shorter biography of Mordecai Richler that's coming out next spring. So 5 years away from that joyful experience that I feel working on fiction. So much as I've loved writing these books, I'm looking forward to returning to fiction. I'd love for readers to come away with a new understanding of him as an artist and as a man. There are discoveries and revelations in the book that I believe will change the perception. The public perception of Mordecai Richler, at least, was tough, irascible, impatient, curmudgeonly was a word that was often used to describe his public persona. And that's true, but very, very narrow view of him. The larger man was complex, vulnerable, sensitive, decent, kind, and was formed by some very terrible circumstances in his childhood, terrible events. So I would like to leave people with a rich, complex portrait of him that would then in turn send them to his books, back to those major novels in particular, with a greater insight into why he wrote them. You have no story about Mordecai? I bet you do. Just a fan. I've been inundated since the book was published about 2 weeks ago.